This presentation will be on macroeconomic equilibrium, which is really an economic state in which aggregate demand meets aggregate supply. The current state of the economy is affected by factors including unemployment and CPI conditions and can be temporarily revived with different implementations of fiscal policy by the government. Before we look at the three different types of economic gaps, it is important to first understand what our economy would look like at an ideal economic state in which it would function the best. This is known as full employment equilibrium or long-run equilibrium, which holds the economy to a 5% unemployment standard and a 3% CPI standard. Remember, if one is unemployed, it means that they are still actively looking for a job. The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed persons as a percent of the labor force, which does not include those in the labor force who are people who are unable to work or choose not to work. CPI measures changes in the price level of an economy and is measured by a market basket of 400 goods and services according to how much the average consumer spent in the base year. To calculate CPI, the cost of a product is the current year divided by the cost of the same product in the base year and multiplied by 100. Anyway, back to the full employment equilibrium graph. This graph tells us that an increase in demand at this full employment level will result only in an increase in price level and a decrease in the unemployment level. However, an increase in the short-run aggregate supply would still result in a decrease in the unemployment level, but an increase in price level. At this point, the economy cannot produce any more goods and services for a sustainable period of time. Now that we have an understanding as to what an ideal economy looks like, we can start to consider how our economy would be graphed in other circumstances, and also how our government might attempt to resolve such situations. It is important to know that when our economy does land in any economic gap other than full employment equilibrium, it is the goal of the government in order to return our country back to that long-run equilibrium state, as we know that those are the parameters in which our economy functions the best. There are various ways in which the government can try to get the economy back to full employment level. One particular way is through different implementations of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the government's, or really Congress's, levels of taxation and spending used to influence the economy. The policies that they choose depends on whether the current economic level is above or below either the ideal unemployment or CPI standards, so 5% for unemployment or 3% for CPI. If the government needs to implement fiscal policy, there are certain formulas established that determine how much money they would either gain or cut in taxes or government spending. These numbers come from the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. This is the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. Additionally, one can also derive the marginal propensity to save, or MPS, from this number, as what is not consumed must be saved. For example, an MPC of 0.8 would mean that the MPS is equal to 0.2. So in order to figure out how much money the government would either add or reduce from their spending budget, one would use the formula 1 divided by the MPS. And in order to figure out how much taxes would be decreased, the formula is the marginal propensity to consume divided by the marginal propensity to save times -1. So if there is a tax cut, the tax multiplier will end up being positive, and if there is an increase in taxes, the multiplier will have a negative value. These multipliers can be applied to the two different types of solutions the government would implement to drive the economy back to full employment equilibrium, expansionary or contractionary policies. No, an expansionary policy would mean that either taxes will decrease, government spending will increase, or mix between those two. Contractionary is the exact opposite, meaning that there would either be an increase in taxes and a decrease in government spending, or both. This is where we would use the different multipliers we looked at to find out how exactly budgets and taxes will change, how much exactly budgets and taxes will change by. Now we can apply these policies to different economic gaps. One such gap would be a recessionary gap. A recession occurs when there is a negative change in aggregate demand, causing a decrease in the price level and an increase in unemployment. Therefore, a recessionary gap is characterized by any unemployment percentage above 5% and any CPI percentage under 3%, such as if there were 10% unemployment and 2% CPI. In the government's attempt to get the economy back to full employment equilibrium, they would need to implement an expansionary fiscal policy. So by either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, consumption would increase, which would push aggregate demand back to its ideal spot. In order to figure out how much the government would either cut back or increase spending or taxes, one would use the different multipliers we looked at before. So let's just say that for this certain recession, the government would prefer to increase aggregate demand by decreasing taxes, which would promote more consumption in the economy, and that the MPC is 0.9 and the MPC is 0.9 and the MPS is 0.1. Since the tax multiplier is negative MPC over MPS, we would end up with a multiplier of negative 9, and when multiplied with, let's say, a $50 billion increase in taxes, there would be an overall $450 billion decrease in taxes. Another type of economic gap would be an inflationary gap. An inflation occurs when aggregate demand is too high, causing an increase in the overall price level of the economy and actually a decrease in unemployment. Inflations occur when there is less than 5% unemployment and a CPI over 3%. Circumstances such as these would call for a contractionary fiscal policy. The government could get aggregate demand back down by either decreasing government spending or increasing taxes, as that would lower the consumption within the economy. This time, let's have the government decrease aggregate demand by decreasing government spending, so consumption would decrease in the economy, and let's set the MPC at 0.8 and the MPS at 0.2. 1 over the MPS is the formula to find the government spending multiplier, which would give us a value of 5. If there is a $20 million decrease in government spending, we would multiply that by 5, which means that government spending will decrease by $100 million. A stagflationary economic gap differs from recessions and inflations in a couple of ways. It is caused by a change in short-run aggregate supply instead of aggregate demand, usually a decrease. This means that there is increasing inflation and rising unemployment in the economy at the same time, which means that an unemployment rate must be over 5% and CPI percent must also be over 3%. The fact that there is both inflation and unemployment present within this economic gap makes it so there's not just one simple answer in order for the government to bring the economy back to a state of full employment equilibrium. They could choose to implement an expansionary policy, which would increase aggregate demand and fix the issue of rising unemployment, but the price level would remain too high. They could implement a contractionary policy, which would help bring the price level back down, but leave high levels of unemployment. Clearly, either way they choose, there will be trade-offs. So those are the different types of economic gaps and how the government would work to fix them with fiscal policy. Remember, the whole goal is to return the economy back to long-run equilibrium, as that is where the economy functions best.